Two of the Big 12's best meet up in the historic Fog Allen this weekend, but it might not have the same kind of lore it used to have. Let's jump in.
You are Locked On College Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to a crossover edition of Locked On Cougs and Locked On Jayhawks. I'm one of your hosts, Parker Ainsworth, Locked On Cougs, joined by Derek Johnson of Locked On Jayhawks. And Derek, I always ask a weird question to start shows. It's typically got something to do with food. I feel like when we've done this before, I talked with you about barbecue. Is there a Kansas food that's not barbecue? Should I know something about Kansas cuisine besides barbecue?
No, I mean it's just I don't know. I guess it would just be barbecue is what you're kind of known for there. But you have other foods. The beauty of if you come out to Lawrence, go to Mass Street, you're not going to get a lot of like chain restaurants. It's a lot of local eateries, and you can get a lot of different. You want Italian food, you want a good burger. There's a lot of different places you can go.
And if you're out there listening to this on your way to the game or whatever aspect of your travel and getting ready for it you are in, today's was brought to you by Game Time, the place to get last minute tickets, the lowest price guaranteed. But we got more on that later. Derek, we had a big basketball game this weekend.
Pretty big, yeah, pretty important. Pretty important for Houston trying to get their 12th straight win. Kansas trying to just stay atop the Big 12. I mean, if Kansas loses this game, they'd have 3 losses. Houston would be 8-0. You can probably kiss the Big 12 title race from the Kansas perspective goodbye. Obviously, Houston would be in good situation there. And for Houston, they still have to fend off Iowa State and Arizona and some of these other schools. But it's kind of do or die mode from that perspective for Kansas, which I guess we could get into, like just how important is winning the Big 12 in today's day and age where these conferences are so ballooned up and, you have imbalanced schedules and stuff like that. Like it feels like it is more tailored to just what seed are you going to get in the NCAA tournament? But if you win the Big 12, you're probably going to get a 1 seed in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, and that's certainly how it worked out for Houston a year ago. They won the regular season Big 12 by actually 2 games. And then in the conference tournament, I guess they got to the final, and the final itself, they kind of ran out of gas. It was a little bit of an embarrassing score. And like you mentioned, that didn't really matter as far as seeding goes. I think if you'd asked someone in August, they'd said, like, that's the biggest game of the Big 12 this week. And, Houston took a couple losses early. Kansas a couple losses as of late. That has shaped this one a little bit differently. What are Kansas folks feeling, and what are Kansas folks thinking about Houston with those 3 losses coming in?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of people really respect what Kelvin Sampson has done and know how good Houston is. Obviously, what I find interesting is on KenPom, their net rating right now is actually higher than it was a season ago. But also, I've heard from some Kansas fans and that are optimistic about how this is going to go and pointing to the fact that, okay, but who are the best wins right now on the resume for Houston, right? Like, who do you point to and say, oh, well, that's proof that they can beat this other top team? And my kind of counter has been, I know they lost to Auburn and Alabama, the top teams they played, but they lost one in overtime, and the Auburn one, they were up late and gave up a couple buckets late. But that kind of is the big question right now. But yeah, I mean, you look at Houston, number 1 defense in the country. It's just kind of classic on and on. And I'd be curious from your perspective because this has not been a vintage Kansas season, so to speak. Obviously there's still a lot of other schools would take this down year, I guess you would call it, for Kansas. Obviously, I think they've been better than they were last year. But when you look at the Houston perspective, I'm very curious if you're comparing to past years, because you look at last year's Houston team that I just mentioned, they're lower on KenPom and net rating, but like last year had Jamal Shead. And, last year's Houston team, if he doesn't get injured in the Duke game, like who knows how far they go in that NCAA tournament. I don't know. I just even though I think Houston is an awesome team this year and probably has the best defense in the country, I have a hard time believing they're really better than last year's team. So, like, what is the pulse on where Houston is at right now?
Yeah, last year, Houston was absolutely the Jamal Shead show when he needed to be, right? So he was the backpack guy is kind of what I've been calling him. It's like at the end of the game, everyone jumps in the backpack and he carries us to whatever. And if that means he's got to get 29 against Texas, he does it. If he gets 12 assists here, he does it. If that means he guards your best player, he does it, right? This year's been more of a committee kind of thing. Houston did return like 8 of the 9 rotational guys from last year's team. Like they return a lot, right? Jamal Shead was just the one exodus, and he's a pretty big deal. He's a Big 12 Player of the Year, right? as we look at this year's group, they've kind of shared that. And if I'm being honest, you mentioned losses to Auburn, losses to Alabama and San Diego State, both in Las Vegas. I guess all three were on neutral floors technically. The real trick there was those all happened before November 30th, where they're still trying to find who that guy is. You're playing Auburn, who we now know is one of the best teams in America. You're playing Alabama, who was coming off of a Final Four, and we know is a very good team, right? San Diego State, I have other thoughts on that. They just played bad in that one. But the truth there is that, like, that's really early, and you're replacing your point guard and best player, and they didn't really know what their options were. I mean, they were up late in both of the Alabama and Auburn games, didn't go their way. If the Petaway kid doesn't get hot, I mean, he had 12 points in 4 minutes, kind of hot early in the season. Like, who knows what that win looks like now, right? So I think people chalked it up to early season kind of miscues. I will say it's been a while since we've played a team ranked as high as Kansas, even in your town here, though, like you're saying. So it changes up the game a little bit for sure.
Yeah, and obviously the other part of this is, okay, well, Houston beat West Virginia by double digits, and Kansas lost that game in Allen Fieldhouse, and obviously Kansas has made a lineup change since then. But do you think this Houston team is as good as last year's?
I think that because of the depth, they can sustain an injury better. Whereas last year it was like, we had guys getting hurt. JoJo Tugler missed the last month of the season with a broken foot. Terrence Arsenault tore his Achilles in December, right? And then Jamal Shead in the ankle, right, in the Sweet 16 end of the season. I think this team could withstand an injury to the rotation. I don't want, knock on wood, I'm not wishing for it, but I think they could better, right? That said, we've also seen, like, sometimes you just need the better Jimmy or Joe. It's not about what else you do, right? And so I do, obviously, we all miss Jamal a lot and wish we kind of had that guy. It's been like UCF, they played a close against UCF in Orlando the other day, and it was Juwan Roberts, right? Like, there's been moments where it looks like it's a different guy for this game or a different guy for that game. LJ Correa had a stretch had like over 23 games in a row or something. Like, there's guys can pop up, but the consistency, who do we know it's going to be? Who can we fall back to is certainly missing. You just kind of, if you start beating teams like that did Utah and TCU, you might not need it. I don't know. That's, I think, the route they've been lately. Anyway, that's kind of what I'm feeling on it. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you do look at the three losses they had, as well as the UCF game, because every other game is a double-digit win right now, so those would be the commonalities of games that either they lost or were closest to losing. Is there one thing, or is there a key common denominator that you look at and say, okay, this is what usually happens when they do get close to losing, whether it's something the team's doing, whether it's a style of play of the other team, or like a type of player that has caused them troubles? Like, what do you look at there?
It's all about how do you take the guards out, right? So against UCF, you kind of had a down LJ Cryer game. He had just 6 points. Emmanuel Sharp finished with 9, but he didn't score for a long time in that one. Those guys are both over 13 points per game, right? And then in like Alabama and Auburn, your point guard Miles Uzan fouls out. Like that's a big deal. The point guard kind of orchestrate. The offense is very pro feeling in a lot of ways, where the point guard has to do a lot of the setup. And then you're without in those games where he fouled out, Jamal Shead from last year, and then your current point guard Miles Uzan. No one's on the team has really run a lot of point at that point in the game, right? So, hurting their guards in terms of like disrupting what they're trying to do, it seemed to be pretty effective. I will say, like against UCF, the big men showed up and ended up winning the game for them. And Alabama and Auburn were a combined 10 points. I mean, it's not like they were like blown out in those games or something like that. So they still find ways to be competitive. It's just that's been the commonality, I guess, amongst all four of those.
Well, I think it's going to be a fun one in Allen Fieldhouse. Let's get to the Kansas side of things after a quick timeout here.
Yeah, we got to take a timeout to tell you about our buddies over at Game Time, because if you're attending an NFL playoff game, and I know Kansas folks, I mean, if you're up there this weekend, there's a pretty big playoff game in Kansas, the state of Kansas anyway, this weekend.
State of Missouri. People are going to come for you. People right across the border. Kansas City, Missouri.
You can drive there. Yes. But the excitement at that game is something you cannot replicate. Connection in a playoff game between fans and the stadium, the atmosphere is just rivaled, and Game Time makes it easier to create those unforgettable moments with their new feature, the Game Time Picks. It filters out all the fluff and shows you only the best deals on great seats so you can focus on what matters, which is being there. Now, I actually used Game Time to purchase some holiday gifts. I thought giving experiences sounded like a good idea, and using the Game Time app made it super easy to find incredible seats, great values, and you can even preview what it's going to look like in that arena for that type of event from their Game Time app. The all-in pricing means you know exactly what you're paying for. Knowing the tickets are back, the Game Time guarantee gives you complete peace of mind. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply again. Create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, Derek, you mentioned that West Virginia game. And I got to be honest, I don't mean to harp on one single game to indict someone's season on, because that would not be fair to either one of these programs. But I do think part of my fear before the season about this game would have been, frankly, the difference in this game when it was played in Fog Allen versus in Fertitta last year, right? Like in Fog Allen, Houston looked kind of rattled. I think it was like a 14-point loss or something for Houston. And then when it came down to the H and played at Fertitta Center, it was all things Houston all the time, right? It didn't look like they were playing the same sport at one point. And I don't mean to rub that in, but I do think that my fear about this game initially was you got to go there, though, right? And so I guess from the West Virginia game, what happened at Kansas that night? And then I want to steal it and use it, but what happened in Kansas that night?
Yeah, it was kind of a sleepy game. It was the December 31st game. It was a day game coming into New Year's night. It was your first game back from Christmas break. So I don't know if that played into it at all in terms of kind of sleepwalking into it. And then what happened, the weird part about it was West Virginia had all sorts of travel issues, and they were playing down. Like, they were playing without guys. So, like, they were actually the team that was, backs against the wall a little bit more, you would think, than Kansas was. But their head coach, DeVries, came up with a wonderful system and scheme to basically raise the line where Hunter Dickinson was, and they basically just attacked them with relentless cuts and all this backdoor action that led to a bunch of easy layups at the rim. They went 12 of 13 at the rim in the game, did West Virginia, and they jumped out to an early lead. It was a combination of that. It was a combination of Kansas just looked lethargic, and that's been a common theme this year for KU, oddly enough. They've had a lot of slow starts to games. They just had one against TCU this past week. They had one against Missouri and Creighton in losses earlier this year. Slow starts to games where they haven't come out with a lot of energy. And they found that energy in the second half, as they have in a lot of these situations. But just like the Missouri game, just like the Creighton game, they dug themselves too deep of a hole in the first half to be able to come from behind. And so they ended up having a good second half. They figured out this lineup of playing Flory Padunga next to Hunter Dickinson, which doesn't sound like it'd work in today's day and age of modern basketball with two centers next to each other, but it did. And the lineup, they've continued to go to it at different points. In fact, now they're starting that lineup with KJ Adams being injured right now, and it's worked a lot better. Also, since this point in time, they entered Shakeel Moore into the starting lineup. So Shaq Moore was a transfer from Mississippi State, known as a really good defensive guard, really athletic guard who can kind of get his own bucket a little bit here or there. In that game, Shakeel Moore only played 2 minutes. And to that point in the season, he was not really playing much at all. It'd be 5 minutes here, 3 minutes there, 5 minutes another game. Part of it was he had an injury at the beginning of the season and was working back. Gets into the starting lineup the game after that. From then on, they've only lost one game. It was at Iowa State. They blow out UCF. They win by double digits against TCU and at Cincinnati. So there's a couple things at play. One, they found their starting lineup a little bit better now. Two, it was just kind of a bad game. And three, I think West Virginia, Javon Small was fantastic in that game. He had a near triple-double, and they were just, I think, kind of the better team that day. And there was some weird stuff that happened late in the game. Kansas almost found a way to come back and win the game, but they end up fouling Javon Small on a three. They have a weird last-second play. It was just kind of a weird game that certainly shows this team has the ability to lose a game at home, which, normally that doesn't happen in a given year, or at most you're losing one at home at Allen Fieldhouse, but certainly problematic, but they have shook it off since that point. And in fact, since Friday, leading into a weekend, since Shakeel Moore entered the starting lineup, basically, if you look at Bart Torvik, the number one defense in the country is Houston. Since that point, the number two defense in the country is Kansas.
Well, and I guess that lineup can help shed some light on what I want to ask next, because whether it's the the Big 12 squad text group or following you on Twitter or whatever, it sounds like the Hunter Dickinson experience has been a roller coaster. And you're acting like it's a simple, like some lineup fixtures around him that might have been unconventional. Is that really opened him up some that maybe didn't have him earlier when you lose to guys like Creighton and Missouri? Like what's shifted in him and what part of the roller coaster are we on right now?
It's a really tough discourse with Hunter Dickinson because he puts up unbelievable All-American level production when you look at the box score. And that is worth something. He was really good in Kansas' win over Houston last year at home when he had 20 points. At the same point in time, there's certain defensive deficiencies. Now, I know there are certain numbers out there that say, and like if you can get him in a one-on-one post-up setting or just allow him to be big because he is gigantic on defense, then like he can be effective there. But if you can get him out in ball screens, get him out in space, that's where problems occur. Now, the problem on the offensive end that had been running up to recently was there just wasn't spacing for him down low. And the lineups where you're playing KJ next to Hunter, it just wasn't working well. And to the point where up until KU's game against Kansas State on Saturday, Hunter Dickinson only had one game shooting 45% or better from the floor in Big 12 play. The spacing wasn't there, and I think that hurt him. So KJ Adams being hurt right now, it certainly hurts the team from a physicality perspective, from having another senior on the court, he's probably been their best defender so far this season, but I think it has opened things up a little bit more for Hunter. Plus, one thing I think is interesting, Hunter has really struggled shooting the three ball this year. He was proficient at it the past couple of years, although he had one long cold spell last season at Kansas. He hasn't taken a single three the last two games. He's been struggling at it this year. I wonder if there's some sort of mindset shift coming from him, coming from Bill Self, whoever, to kind of get your butt down in the post and do the work that you need to be done. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly been an interesting one among KU fans because you get the standpoint where it's like, well, the dude's averaging 16 and 10. Like, what do you want him to do? And then you get the other standpoint where it's like, yeah, but he's not hustling hard enough. He's not doing this or that. There is certainly a polarizing player among KU fans.
Well, you mentioned Bill Self, getting on his butt and coaching him up, and obviously Bill Self, Kelvin Sampson, both two of the legends in the sport. One thing that stuck out of me is like, I didn't anticipate that from a Bill Self team, but I also don't follow them as closely as you do, so maybe it's more common. They shoot very few free throws. And that, to me, as a coach, indicates like you're not attacking the rim, getting in the paint, shooting a lot of jump shots. It's a lot less fouls on jump shots, right, and that kind of stuff. But you're also saying that Hunter Dickinson's not shooting a bunch of threes anymore. So I guess, like, is someone else shooting the ball from outside? Why aren't they shooting any free throws? Why aren't they getting the line? Is it just a bunch of bad refs? Like, what's going on there?
It's been a big talking point here, and I think part of the issue, because like here's the thing, if you look at the amount of shots that KU takes at the rim, 36% of KU shots, right, are coming at the rim this season. They've taken 684 shots at the rim, and that puts them in the 90th percentile in the country in the amount of shots that they're taking at the rim. So it's not a problem of like they're not taking shots at the rim. They're taking shots at the rim at a very high rate. I think part of the problem is, like you said, you view guys who get fouled. I view them as like guys who are attacking on a straight line drive or are trying to overpower someone and they get overpowered back, right? Hunter Dickinson is kind of a back to the basket, like going to flip one up, like not really going to go into the contact, if that kind of makes sense. So it's not going to draw as many fouls. I do think that, KJ isn't somebody who's taken like a ton of shots so far this season. Most of his shots have been kind of like push shots or wide open dunks. So like,
and folks know I love KJ Adams for a lot of personal reasons, but he's not a great free throw shooter. like that's not the guy you want doing it, I don't think.
No, but so, I mean, it's a combination of things. Like DeJuan Harris is somebody who can hit a floater or something, but he's not really driving to get fouled. Zeke Mayo is more of a shooter. So I think it's a combination. One, could maybe they get a little bit friendlier of a whistle in certain situations. I mean, sure. But like, I don't know. I think part of it is personnel based. And I was actually surprised. I was going back in some of the numbers of Bill Self's time at Kansas and like, because you're right. I think of like Bill Self teams, some of the past ones of being these tough-nosed teams that are going to get to the free throw line. But here's their rankings of free throw rate the past couple of seasons. Obviously this year it's 364th, but 186, 227th, 112th, 220th. Like there's some years at 2018, they were 329th. So that one made sense because they shot a lot of threes. So I don't know. I think it's a personnel thing a little bit. And I think that maybe the lineup with Floyd Badunga, they've been doing a little bit better job getting it recently, but yeah, it's certainly a bit of a head scratcher.
It's just one that's interesting when you think of how many talented basketball players on it. I mean, it's got some of the best recruiting in the country here, and you're out and all. They had the transfer portal hard. They get the Zeke Mayos of the transfer portal and that kind of stuff too. And last question before we talk about this game in particular, how has that, because Houston retained a lot of its returners, brought in one transfer this year and really like one or two the year before, right? Um, Kansas has a lot more than that. Not like some rosters out there that completely turn over. Has the integration taken time? How's that worked in terms of pulling guys in?
Yes, it has taken some time, and Bill Self is typically very hard to crack the lineup for. And we've seen that right now. AJ Storr's coming off a double-digit point game against TCU. Before that, it had been really getting nothing from AJ Storr, who was an All Big Ten second-team performer from a year before. So the question is if he can build on that coming into the Houston game. Like Rylan Griffin has shown some good flashes, but hasn't really been able to consistently crack into Bill Self's circle of trust, so to speak. It takes time with Bill Self, and Zeke Mayo's kind of been the one guy who hit the ground running right away and has lasted the whole way through with transfer coming in who has been able to find that trust with Bill Self. Like I said, with Shakeel Moore, he's found it now, but it took him till January to do so. With Storr and Griffin, it's been kind of yo-yoing in back and forth. So it has not been smooth sailing with the transfer portal, I would say, so far for Bill Self.
Well, as we, I guess, transition to the third segment, we do need to talk about this game in particular. And I guess I'll start with you because I'm already asking questions about Kansas, and I think there's a lot of ways this game goes either way. FanDuel, as of recording of this episode, FanDuel's not have the line out, but KenPom's got a 1-point game, right? I mean, that is a true toss-up in any way that KenPom could do it. I want to know what you think if Kansas were to win this game. If Kansas is victorious come Saturday night, what will they have done right? What's something they've got to do to win the game?
I mean, this doesn't sound like a statistical thing, but it's like they have to play tough. When I think of Houston basketball, when I think of Kelvin Sampson basketball, I think of toughness. And that can come in a lot of different forms, right? That can come in rebounding. That can be coming, winning 50-50 balls. That can come in being the first on the floor. That can come in finishing through contact. There's a lot of different stuff that can come through. Kansas has to play tough. And going back to what I said earlier about how the season has gone, they've had some games where they haven't played with that full energy at the beginning of the game. I think if you're a tough team, you come out and play with energy in this game against Houston. You don't get walloped in the mouth right away. I think that would be something that I would look to. Beyond that, you have to take care of the basketball. I mean, Houston forces turnovers at such a good rate. You can, I think, live with those dead ball turnovers. You can't have the live ball turnovers that are going to lead to easy points for Houston because these are two really good defenses. And I'll be very interested to see how Houston, Kansas typically has struggled against teams who can space them out and shoot threes with this iteration of the team. But I am curious from a matchup perspective because they do play kind of three smaller guards. The way Kansas has been playing lately has been three smaller guards around two big men. So, I mean, stylistically, there's some similarities there that I wonder if KU will be able to match up okay there, and that this will be a lower scoring game, and it could come down to the margins, and the margins are the toughness. The margins are, taking care of the basketball, not turning it over, maximizing those possessions so you can get shots up. Flip side, Houston wins this one if what?
I think they got to win the turnover battle. It's funny. We didn't converse beforehand. I know we're going to do the exact similar thing. But this is one of the few teams, as far as like top end teams that Houston will play, that they might actually have a size advantage in the guard room, right? DeJuan Harris is 6'2", Miles Uzan 6'4", Shakeel Moore is listed at 6'1". I got him right here. LJ Cryer is listed at 6'2", and then Zeke Mayo is listed at 6'4", and Emmanuel Sharp, who is supposed to start. He rolled his ankle in practice on Tuesday, sat out Wednesday's game. I think more precautionary. Like Kelvin Sampson said after the game, he didn't know till warm-ups he wasn't going to play. He's 6'3". The guy that came in and started for him, Terrence Armstrong, was 6'5" and change. I say to say that Houston actually has some size there, and if they can use that length to force the issue here. The issue is that it feels like Houston's going to have to force the issue with turnovers. A very Bill Self aspect of this team is that they don't commit turnovers that aren't like unforced turnovers or like top 20 in the country, it looks like to me, as I'm reading the stats here on KenPom. And that's indicative, I think, of a team that you're going to have to make them make mistakes, right? And so Houston's going to have to do those kinds of things. Now, against Utah, who, we can all kick out of the Big 12 at this point, I think, they did. Utah committed 24 turnovers and made 13 field goals. That's insane, right? Against UCF, it was just 13 turnovers, and we saw how close that game was. And I don't mean to knock UCF a whole lot. I think Kansas has better basketball players than UCF, regardless of how they play, right? And so that's going to be a big deal, is forcing the turnovers with the backcourt guys. In the front court, I think it's controlling the pace, not letting Hunter Dickinson be comfortable and really kind of making him play, like you mentioned, kind of a Houston style of basketball, because as you've alluded to, that's not really his comfort zone. He's not the guy who's going to beat you up physically. He's a little more finesse to his game. Houston's got some junkyard dog to him, right? And so I think that's what Houston have to do in this one. Obviously, those could both lead to fouls and fouling out and all kinds of problems. But I think that's how this would go if Houston wins. And now I'm going to put you in a spot a little bit, Derek. Make your prediction. You've been very honest about Kansas all year long. What do you think's happening Saturday?
So I am actually picking Houston in this one. I think they have the toughness factor. I think Kansas has figured out the defense as the season has gone on, but I do have questions about the offense. And when you're playing the number one defense in the country and you're coming off a game where you just had 17 turnovers against TCU, I don't know that is a great recipe for beating this really good Houston team. So there is a part of me that thinks Kansas wins the game just because it'll be close and Allen Fieldhouse magic and stuff like that. But right now I would be picking Houston to pull this upset on well, I guess not an upset, but feels weird not saying a team coming into Allen Fieldhouse should be an upset. But I think it'll be a good game though, regardless. At least it'll be a close game. I don't know how good it'll be. It might be one of those ugly, like you have the Ken Palm lineup there if you're watching on YouTube, 64-63. Might be kind of an ugly game, but I think it'll be a close one.
Well, and I have to stress that if you broke 60, as the Ken Palm prediction says, that hasn't happened a whole lot to Houston this year. And Houston is coming off a few wins in a row, but they're really, in all those wins, are keeping teams down in the low 50s, with the exception of UCF. So, I don't mean to sound like a total homer. I'm going to pick Houston too, I think. And I think the deal is like you're saying, it's like Houston's a little bit more prepared for the moment, I think, than they might have been a year ago. First year in the Big 12, got a bunch of returners. And then for what it's worth, Milos came to Houston from Oklahoma, so he's been in the Big 12, played in Fog before. I kind of feel like it is going to be maybe a 2-possession game, so maybe it's more like 4 than the 1 point Ken Palm is saying. I don't mean to make it not close. I think Houston's got a little bit of an edge in this one, and like you're saying, Kansas kind of, to me, feels like a team that's still figuring themselves out and might be better in late February or March than they are right now. But it's certainly not the teams. It doesn't feel like the same kind of team in mid-January that they've won titles with in the past, right? So I kind of am playing both of that and feeling like Houston should be pretty comfortable in this one. Obviously, it is a single game. It is a game on the road, and all kinds of crazy things can happen. Obviously, both these schools also have a lot of basketball news these days. Where are people finding you and all the basketball stuff you got going? Kansas Jayhawks basketball is a national appeal, right?
That's right. Locked On Jayhawks, anywhere you get your podcast, and on YouTube as well. And you can give me a follow at D Johnson Radio on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it.
Whatever you want to call it. About the same thing. Pains if I went to on Twitter and X and all that kind of stuff. I live tweet throughout the game and then go live afterwards. Obviously, folks over at Locked On Jayhawks, you got post-game stuff planned and all that kind of stuff going on as well. So make sure you subscribe to both channels. Hit the bell so know when we go live. Game tips off at 5:30 Central Time. It's Kansas Central Time. So, yeah.
Yes.
It's 5:30 local time as well for all folks trying to get in and watch this one. Should be a fun Big 12 matchup. Houston's still looking for a quad 1 win, actually. So that's kind of a big deal here. They had to, but West Virginia has fallen out of the top 30 and UCF has fallen out of the top. Like they fell out after the fact. But anyway, this has been a crossover edition of Locked On Cougs and Locked On Jayhawks. Thank you so much for making this your first, second, third, whatever listen of the day it is for you at this point, depending on what channel you're on. Locked On Cougs and Locked On Jayhawks are both proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network and recommend Locked On College Basketball for your next listen to go keep the hoops talk going. Thanks again, and go Cougs, folks. Go Cougs.